Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories Podcast. My name is Tim Hannon.
I'm Steve Wirt.
In this episode, we talk to the authors of a new book that covers a lot of ground when it comes to local sports history, and we have some really interesting discussions. David Finoli has written almost 50 books on Pittsburgh sports history, covering a ton of diverse topics. If you like this show, you will no doubt like David's books. Tom Rooney is also an author, in addition to being the former president of the Pittsburgh Penguins and the owner of the Rooney Sports and Entertainment Group. He's also a Rooney. He's the Chief's nephew, and he has a lot of good nuggets in this episode about his career in Pittsburgh sports. The book that these two guys have collaborated on is about the history of sports in Pennsylvania, specifically 50 unique stories. And as we get into in the interview, there's a wealth of great Pittsburgh stories in here, but also some really interesting stories from places like Greensburg or Carlisle or Hershey or Latrobe. You can get the book in Pittsburgh area bookstores or online at Amazon or on David's website, 21-66books.com, which we will link in the show description. So we hope you enjoy this conversation with David Finoli and Tom Rooney. Well, thank you both for joining us. Like Steve and I, you both obviously have a passion for sports and specifically for telling stories about local sports history. David, where does that passion come from for you?
I'll tell you what, I grew up in a very passionate sports family. My father and my uncle basically had me grow up watching successful baseball. I wish I could give that gift to my children, but um, they had me at the ballpark from the time I was 6 and 7, and it was something that always bound our family together. And um, Western Pennsylvania sports has just been a passion of mine since then.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wish we could have successful baseball too. Uh, maybe someday we'll all live
Maybe
long enough to
someday.
see it.
Maybe
Uh,
someday.
Tom, I know you're obviously part of a famous sports family. I know you've devoted your career to sports and entertainment in general. Um, did that love of sports for you come at an early age, or was that something that was developed later?
I think there was a confluence of my interest in history. I was a history major my first 2 years at Duquesne before I switched to journalism, and I was in sports area, the Duquesne Duke. But yeah, my whole family are sort of history nuts, and I grew up in the lore of my dad was in a ticket office. My brother was a scout with the Steelers, so I grew up with all the stories, and some of which I will have to go to the grave with me, I might say. But yeah, it's kind of a confluence. Loved history, and it just migrated over to sports. And I was lucky enough to meet David several years ago, and this is actually our 10th collaboration together.
Yeah, I know. I know. David, you've written now, I believe, dozens of books about Pittsburgh sports history, and as Tom said, you guys have collaborated on a bunch of them.
Absolutely.
What made you guys kind of want to expand the reach by doing a book on Pennsylvania sports history as opposed to something that was purely Pittsburgh based?
Well, we had talked about with America 250 coming up, certain ways that we could have a good nice essay based book on history. We started in Western Pennsylvania, and we had done a lot of the same stories through our other collaborations. And Tom had taken it to the next level and thought, what if we did one on Pennsylvania? Um, and to me, I love doing new things. My favorite books are the ones where I go in with some stories I maybe don't have a good knowledge of, that I can immerse myself in the research and come up with some good essays and I thought it was a fascinating idea. We pitched it to the History Press, and they had agreed. And this has been a format we have done in several other books in the past, where we don't necessarily tell a chronological history. We do it in like 50 or more essays. And we try to take them at different angles, which hopefully explain them in a little more interesting way.
I lived in Philadelphia, so I had natural access to people who were very close to Joe Frazier and who knew the history of the Philadelphia Warriors and the Flyers, and so it was kind of easy for me. I think David, the original idea we had was like top 50 coaches, top 50 plays, or whatever, and
Yeah,
I think History Press said, we're tired of lists.
yeah,
But when David first approached me about this, concept, I thought this is out of the realm from me because David's done it, but I haven't done this sort of, way of doing things. But he said, Tom, once you start writing them, they'll be easy. And, he assigned me 12 chapters. And after two, it was really free flowing. It was just trying to, track down, people to talk about it. We didn't want to sort of regurgitate details. We wanted to find, nuances and untold stories about big stories that people might find fascinating.
So that's funny that you guys say that, because I feel like we have the same sort of passion with this podcast. I think we really love the we tell a lot of stories about well-known Pittsburgh sports history topics, but I think some of our favorite episodes have been where we've explored stories that most fans don't know about. And so it sounds like there's a lot of that in your book as well.
Yeah, I think one chapter that probably typifies that for me is I did sports movies, of which there are plenty in Pennsylvania over the years. But Rocky Blyer is a very close friend of mine, and we've talked a lot over the years about his movie, Fighting Back, which is a made-for-TV movie, and it's always to Rocky's chagrin, Rudy played one game, one play, and there's a major motion picture about him. And Rocky's one of the great sports heroes of all time. And it came at a time when the studios didn't think that sports movies were broad based enough. So you had like Brian's Song and Fighting Back, and those sports movies were all sort of made for TV movies at the time. So I had fun contrasting Rocky, in Pittsburgh, and Rocky Balboa in Philadelphia. So that was a lot of fun. We've actually talked about, there could be a whole book about the sports movies made, in Pennsylvania. Both cities do a tremendous job with getting films made there. That could be a book on its own.
yeah. One of my favorite chapters that Tom did, which another one we've talked about doing a book on its own, was teams that are no longer there,
Right.
from the USFL, the WTT. I mean, just so many teams that have come through this. The Pittsburgh Maulers that Tom was a big part of that, and just that was my first season ticket right out of college, and just remembering those things was a lot of fun as I was going through Tom's chapter.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them. I think I did a Google search on defunct Pennsylvania sports teams, and there must have been 100. A lot of them were minor league baseball teams. That back at the time when Major League Baseball had D level teams. You know what I mean? They would have had like 13 affiliations. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. I harken back to my own chapter that I wrote about the Maulers, which was called One and Dumb. Which was the whole idea of the Maulers. But I just made them a smaller part. But there were just so many other really, good stories, about those teams that have, kind of come and gone.
Tom, I just had a question. You were talking about the Rocky Blyer movie being a made-for-TV movie. Of course, he had to be flattered that Robert Urich was playing him, which that's an upgrade from Rock there. But I wonder, if you had any thoughts on this, like being that time that movie was made, what, late 70s, early 80s?
I think 81, yes.
Yeah, so we're still like, I've noticed like a cultural shift just my father was a Vietnam veteran himself. Back then, like that war was still so unpopular,
Right.
and that still infected the media, that I wonder if at that time they weren't able to make a major mojo picture that would portray a Vietnam veteran and that war in a positive light. Do you feel that maybe played into it? These movies just being at least that movie, like you said, Rocky played one play and he gets a whole movie because it's an inspirational tale. And I would think that Rocky's story is even more inspirational. Here's a guy like almost lost his dream while doing the right thing. I wonder if they almost like if they remade it now because of the way the culture has shifted again. I bet that would be a successful. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good point. There were a lot of great Vietnam era movies like Good Morning Vietnam and others that came out, well after that. So maybe it took a settling in period. Rocky kids about Robert York all the time. He said, "Yeah, that's me with hair." But I remember being up there. Art Carney played my Uncle Art, and he hit the ball. He hit it out of the ballpark. He was just tremendous. Fighting Back was written with Rocky and his agent, and they were trying to get control of the book again because there was an effort maybe 8 or 10 years ago, maybe to try to reboot that and make that a movie. But I don't think it's sort of gone anywhere. But yeah, it's amazing when you look back. Younger people don't understand or could never appreciate what it was like for us to live in the 70s, to have 4 Super Bowl teams, 2 World Series teams, Pitt's 1976 championship. I mean, we did a whole book actually on the 1970s, but it was almost there's a saying that there are too many Steelers in Canton. Well, there might have been too many stories on the Steelers, for people to want to accept one more.
So folks, again, the book is Pennsylvania Made, The History of Sports in Pennsylvania. We will have links in the show description on where you can find that, but you should be able to find that in local bookstores as well and online. You guys talked about how the book is broken into 50 unique stories. Talk a little bit about that process of taking the entire state of Pennsylvania sports history and narrowing it down to 50 stories. How did you determine which ones to cover?
Well, we're lucky enough to have I like to call them my Knights of the Sports Roundtable. Historians, writers that we know. Tom had some guys in the Philadelphia area we could go to, and the original idea when I started jotting down stories, I was well over 200 stories. And what we did was we talked to some folks. It was a matter of, we wanted to cover eras. We wanted to cover great teams like, for instance, LaSalle. It was a basketball power in the 1950s, as was our alma mater, Duquesne. So we wanted to get certain angles on that. Tom Gola was one of the greatest college basketball players ever to play, whose time is forgotten. So we wanted to kind of get those angles, those stories of people that have long since forgotten. The 1912 Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which in 1912 was a national champion with Jim Thorpe on the team. Innovated football. Football at the time was more, I'll get my 12 big guys against your 12 big guys, and we'll push each other around the field. Pop Warner and Carlisle figured out, well, maybe speed and running around these big guys could be the way football could be played in the future. And he was very prophetic with that, brought that philosophy to Pitt and won 3 national championships there afterwards. So it was the matters we went through. We wanted to make sure we were hitting every corner of the state with impactful stories and stories of interest. One of my favorites was in the 1930s. You start a 2.5 mile trek between Duquesne University and what is now Carnegie Mellon, And in the 1930s, you found 3 top 10 football programs. You found a team that won a national championship, 5 national championships under Jock Sutherland in that era. Duquesne in 1941, in retrospect, were named the 1941 national championships by the Massey ratings. Carnegie Tech went to the 1938 Sugar Bowl, upset Newt Rockne a couple times. So things like that. I mean, I could only imagine as a college football fan the joy of knowing I could go 2.5 miles up Forbes Avenue and see the pinnacle of college football, no matter where I decided to watch. Although most of it was played in Forbes Field and Pitt Stadium. But that was the way we kind of broke out. We want to make sure we hit the Philadelphia A's. And certainly some of the best teams. Oftentimes the 29 through 31 A's are talked about as the best franchise in or team in baseball history. So that's basically how we tried to break it out.
We also wanted to deal with moments, moments that won't, never be forgotten, or maybe, never, matched again. Wilt's 100. I went to Hershey. I went to that building that's still there. I interviewed a guy named Bob Schaefer, 82 years old, who still works there. He was running the Zamboni. He had to come off the Zamboni to talk to me. He was 18 years old when that happened, and he was what was called a casual. He was working that event. And then Mario's 5 ways goal, on New Year's Eve in 1988, I think it was. The Immaculate Reception, which I kind of wrote a first person thing. I was actually in the broadcast booth that day. And so we took some of those moments, and if we couldn't find an interesting angle to it, I know I wouldn't, I didn't want to just rehash, I wanted to find something. Maz's Homer, I interviewed, in fact, I just kidded him today because he texted me. Bob Rickard was the bat boy, in the for that team. When we went out to the, annual October 13th, where they do the radio play-by-play and hundreds of people hang out in that park in front of the wall. I went out there thinking, wow, I hope there's somebody here, because Maz is like in Jersey, retired. Somebody here who was there. And I ran into Bob Recker, who I knew, and I said, wait a minute, he was the bat boy. So, I was able to interview him. And, I think those moments are that people remember. But those are my most enjoyable chapters, sort of dissecting those big moments, from a different angle.
Yeah, I love that idea of first of all that first person account of history, right? That's always, Steve, you always say that about how important that is. Steve's a big history buff, and you always talk about the first person account being key.
Very amateur too. Very, very amateur.
The Immaculate Reception's been written about 1 million times, and we were actually we helped put together the Immaculate Reception monument with the Steelers. That became actually almost a shrine when Franco passed away. But I was still in college. I was still at Duquesne, and I would work the Steeler games in the broadcast booth. So there I was in the broadcast booth with Kurt Gowdy and Al DeRogatis, and I sort of covered that story from their viewpoint, not from the whole aspect of the play-by-play. But I love doing that because
so you were witness to the infamous phone call that they always complain.
Yeah, I was something I wrote in the book. So and you have to be old enough to remember this, but the Steelers, went into the AFC, with the Colts and the Browns. My uncle was paid $3 million to move the team to the AFC. When the merger happened, and the AFC, DeRogatis and Gowdy, because we worked a lot of games with them, they didn't like the fact that the Baltimore and Pittsburgh became dominant teams, and so I actually felt like they hated the Steelers. I know DeRogatis. That was just the vibe that I got, that we were, we were uninvited guests into the AFC, and we became, so dominant, and Baltimore won in that period too. So that was a lot of fun writing from sort of inside the broadcast. I tell everybody that they say, "Did you see the Immaculate Reception?" I said, "Well, I saw Terry throw the ball, and the next thing I saw was Franco dancing into the end zone. So I missed, I missed the deflection or, sort of the dark corner of the end zone. And anyway, I also tell a story, and it has been told, but I love telling the story that my uncle Art didn't see the Immaculate Reception either. He was on an elevator downstairs on the way to the locker room to console the team. So he missed the Immaculate Reception, which is the greatest play. And he got out of the elevator and people were cheering. He didn't know what happened, So I love writing it, from that standpoint. The other thing about the Immaculate Reception that people might find interesting is that, it's only like 20 feet from second base of Three Rivers Stadium, where Roberto Clemente doffed his hat, on his 3,000th hit. So there's so much history, down on that North Shore, going all the way back to Exposition Park, which which hosted the first World Series in 1903. So Northside Pittsburgh has tremendous, sports history.
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's where just a few blocks up from Acrisure Stadium is where the first Pudge Heffelfinger, the first paid professional football player, played. So the just the history over there was incredible. I got somebody forward me a picture of Exposition Park yesterday that I had never seen before, that was completely flooded over after the 1913 flood in Pittsburgh, which was the reason Barney Dreyfuss ended up going to Oakland to build Forbes Field, was to get as far away from the river as possible. But when you walk through the north side at this, or the North Shore at this point, and just to think about the things that have happened there, to think about even Three River Stadium. We had collaborated on a book on Three River Stadium, the history of it. Cookie cutter, nothing spectacular, pretty much a lousy venue to watch a baseball game. But to us, venues are about the history that's made inside. And you think about the Steeler teams there. You think about, Pitt beat Penn State for the first time in the Joe Paterno era in 1976 at Three River Stadium on their way to the national championship. Duquesne won the 1973 club football championship, national championship at Three River Stadium. The Pirates, of course, to me, second team of the decade in the 70s, right behind the Reds. Even though the A's won 3 titles, which is something I look at in our Pennsylvania Made book. But I mean, just the magnificence of what we were able to see, the Hall of Famers, the moments. When Bob Prince returned in 1984 to announce a game against the Dodgers, only a month or two before he passed away. That was the first game I went to right after I got married with my wife, and we were sitting right below the broadcast booth, and that's one of my cherished memories at that stadium. But you could just go on and on about the things that happened over there.
The official historian for the Josh Gibson Foundation, of which I do a lot of work. I'm wearing number 20 Josh Gibson cap today. He lives in the metro area down in DC, Baltimore. So he was coming up one day because we were doing a symposium, and I took him all around, Pittsburgh to show him where the Grays played and where the Crawfords played. And, he was just amazed that Pittsburgh has done such a great job with memorializing, its sites. I hope the Civic Arena, I hope there's an effort to do that. I was a manager of the Civic Arena in the 80s. And, that building defied logic, lasting 50 years and hosting, the first ABA championship, right?
Yep.
Of course, a couple of I think maybe the first 3 Penguin Cups, I think, were there. But
they were, yeah.
That's a story. That's some history that needs to be retold. So yeah, the Grays and the Crawfords. The chapter I did on that was the 1931 Grays versus the 1935 Crawfords, who was the better team. And Josh Gibson played for both of them because he had switched. And so the historian gave me some great stories about those teams. And can you imagine if the Pirates had been able to tap into all those great players that were already here in Pittsburgh, if they would have taken a leap? I know they worked out some players, early on, but nobody was ready to take that Jackie Robinson leap. It's too bad because Josh Gibson. My Uncle Art told me, and he played against Josh Gibson in barnstorming game. My Uncle Art was a really good baseball player. He had offers to go pro. He loved baseball. He would have found the Pirates and not the Steelers if he could have, but the Pirates weren't available. But he said Josh Gibson was the greatest hitter he ever saw, black, white, or otherwise.
Well, did the Crawfords 35 did that have Satchel Paige, or is that?
Yes. Yeah.
It did have that was the paid the money the guy was it Greenlee paid all the money.
Actually, Satchel wasn't on the 35 team.
Okay.
He had a disagreement with Gus Greenlee in 1934, and
he was a very wealthy businessman, and he paid. Yeah.
And they. The story goes it was at a wedding in the off season. He and Satchel had a disagreement, and Satchel decided to barnstorm in 35. But he was there in 34, which was a pretty damn good team too.
And he still played in the major league for Cleveland in what 48. He played 14 years later. Is he still the oldest rookie in Major League Baseball?
I believe so. Yeah.
That's hard to believe he pitched that long.
And he was effective. That was Cleveland's last World Championship team, and he was real damn good in 48.
Well, they said he used the pitch. I read a quote. He used the pitch that wasn't illegal but wasn't quite legal. He had some sort of stop. He would stop halfway through, kind of like a Louis Tiant kind of thing.
Yeah,
which I love Satchel Paige because his quotes are unbelievable. And when was he born? David, the UCB baseball guy? Does anybody know when he was really born?
I'm sure we could go and get a ballpark figure. I mean, they said, if I'm not mistaken,
there's two different dates I've seen, just wandering the internet, and I don't know. Yeah.
He never told anybody, and he was, I want to say 42 when he was a rookie. At least that's what was listed. It could have been older, but man, I mean, to see him in his prime would have been something just spectacular.
One of the sad things, with our Josh Gibson work is that there is not one second of live action of Josh hitting. There's some video of him sort of smiling, look like he's before a game, like swinging a couple bats, but there's not one iota of footage of him playing. It's kind of a sad thing. We at the foundation, and I think I can say that because I'm a volunteer with the Josh Gibson Foundation. We were overwhelmed by the acceptance of all the Negro League stats, and having Josh pop up as a stat leader in 6 categories. Amazing. We weren't sure what they were going to include and what they weren't going to include. They only included stats of Negro League games, games within their own league, which was 60 or 70 games a year. They played 250 games a year because they went down to the islands and played in the winter. But we were, when you look at the MLB stat line, and you see Josh Gibson and others, that were great players at that time. Cool Papa Bell and others. It's been really gratifying. But again, it calls back to the moment of we had so much talent here, and we really missed it. We also tried to do as much as we could on individual sports. Pittsburgh had an NBA team, a very first NBA team, and after the war in 1946 and 47, the league says that is their first year. I think it was called the Basketball Conference of America or something.
Association of America, the BAA.
Yeah. So we had a team for 1 year. I think, David, were they called the Ironmen? I think they were called Ironmen.
They were the Ironmen, and my old boss, his uncle played on that team, and he would tell me just stories. Nobody showed up
Right.
at those games, but
Yeah.
we were in the first technical NBA season.
And then we had, of course, the 1967-68 ABA champions, the Pipers with Connie Hawkins, which is a great story. But my favorite Pittsburgh sports team, and I wrote about it a little bit, is the Pittsburgh Pisces in the fish that say Pittsburgh. So,
well, they had Dr. J. Come on, man.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So,
and
anyway,
Meadowlark Lemon, I think was yes. Yeah.
So I wrote about that a little bit. That was a riot when that movie was made here, and that's every once in a while it'll pop up on NBA TV, right? You'll see it, and it's so bad it's good, right? It really is good. And then of course Slapshot, which of course we had to mention, which is which is important. And we've got Dave Hansen, who runs Robert Morris's hockey facilities out there. He was one of the Henson brothers, so he's still around. So we got some great stories about Paul Newman and that whole crew. I also had a chance to we've gotten to know Tim McConnell over the years. The McConnell family is really they're to basketball what the Rooney family is to football.
The first family of basketball in Pittsburgh. Oh, yeah, for sure.
My God, the genealogy. I went out and interviewed Kathy Miller McConnell, who's Tim's sister and TJ's aunt, and she's the head coach at CMU. And I had to go through. It was so confusing. In the Irish tradition, you name your first son after your dad. So that's why with the Steelers you get like Art Dan, Art Dan, Art Dan, Art. And so with McConnell's, it's kind of the same thing. It was really, I was like banging my head against the wall trying to figure out all these different people, but I think I finally got it right.
You did a great job with it.
Yeah, that was a fun chapter, and just the history of that family and where they. So
speaking of basketball, we were talking about the ABA and Connie Hawkins, and after it's the weirdest championship ever. After they win the championship, the team moves to Minnesota. Now, either you can answer this. Do you think if the team stays, because I kind of feel there was this window of opportunity for a third major sports team, and I don't know if Pittsburgh could support four, like Philadelphia or LA or New York, like the bigger cities, but I think obviously Pittsburgh can support three, and the Penguins were so fledgling for so many years. If they don't move and they keep Connie Hawkins in that league, are they one of the teams that get absorbed into the NBA? Do you guys think?
I would think so. I mean, the momentum, towards the end of the Steelers stunk. The Penguins were about to stink. And the Pirates were going through a little bit of a bumpy road in 67 and 68 after they got Jim Bunning and Maury Wills, that they were kind of stuck in neutral. But as the season went on, at that last game in Game 7 of the 68 championship, they drew almost 12,000 fans to the Civic Arena, which I think it only held 13,000 at the time before the upper decks were built. And the momentum was going well, and the city was starving for a winner at that point. So yeah, I think there are two things with basketball that would have done in the Penguins eventually. Had the Pipers been sucked into the NBA and been successful, because you remember the Penguins in the mid-70s were in bankruptcy and not doing well financially, and that was their thing until DeBartolo took over. Even then, a couple times it was done. I'm not sure they survived the 74-75 season if the Pipers are successful. That and the fact in 1960, the owner of the Hornets, John Harris, was given an NBA franchise, which we write about in one of our books about when all the facilities in Pittsburgh were in Oakland, and he decided to turn down the franchise after he wasn't able to get his head coach from the Lakers. And the guy who was given the franchise after that decided, oh, well, there's an ABL coming up, the American Basketball League, we'll get a franchise there and we can win quicker. And that ended up being the Wrens, which were out of business after one season, which is probably one of the most poorest decisions in Pittsburgh history to turn down an NBA franchise. But had you had both those opportunities in the NBA, I truly believe the Penguins would not be in existence today, and either the Pipers or that NBA team, because I'm not sure the Pipers would have been in existence had we had an NBA team, would have taken over if they were successful. So yeah, that's a great question.
So that's sort of what we do. I was in St. Louis last week, helping them trying to figure out what to do with the dome. It's still got the St. Louis Rams colors all over it, and they were thinking that maybe with expansion that they might get an NFL team again. They'll never get an NFL team again. But I think the way you look at markets, the way we do anyway, comparable size markets tend to have one or the other major indoor sports. Buffalo has hockey, Pittsburgh has hockey, Cleveland has basketball, Indy has basketball, Columbus has hockey, St. Louis has hockey. You don't have smaller markets, that have both those franchises, unless they're owned by the same ownership, where there's some efficiencies in. But the Penguins, Dave's right. They almost foundered from the beginning. They were very undercapitalized. They made a huge mistake when they tried to launch a soccer team, the Phantoms, at the same time, and it just drained them. They thought, they just didn't have the money. The Phantoms was one of the articles. It was one of the teams I wrote about. The teams that went away, they would be in MLS right now. That was that progression. But I think I wrote in there that I went to one Phantoms game and it was a 0-0 tie with Toronto. So I still haven't seen a goal. But, yeah, I think they could have, but the other thing that I always mention when people bring that up is Duquesne had a great basketball program at that time. Duquesne and Pitt were our basketball. You know what I mean? Duquesne was an NCAA team in the 70s, and they would, they'd largely outdraw anything, that the Pipers or the Condors would do. The decision to move the Pipers to Minneapolis happened before the championship game. That was already a done deal. The owner was Gabe Rubin, I think, David.
Yeah. George Mikan was looking for because his Minnesota Muskies moved out of were moving out of Minnesota,
Right.
and he wanted to keep the ABA offices in Minnesota.
Yeah, they went bankrupt, and then he took his team and they went bankrupt.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. The other Dave, I wanted to mention. You mentioned when Duquesne and Carnegie Mellon were powerhouses. I had the privilege of writing a chapter about the WJ team that was has a national championship claim, and they had the first black quarterback in the Rose Bowl, and what that was all about. That was one of my chapters.
That was a great chapter.
Do you say WJ was a top tier college football?
Oh yeah, in that era, right, David? They were.
Oh wow.
In the teens and 1920s, actually.
Oh, okay. All right.
In retrospect, that team Tom wrote about won the 1921 national championship that they can claim.
They were in those years. There there were 4 or 5 different parties that were naming championships, right, David? Yeah.
Right. What was that weird point system? Was it the Gardner points? You remember that?
Yes.
Was it the Gardner? I remember the Whippeal used to use that. It was like points. I remember my son played youth football and they used it, and I said, "This is the most insane way."
It was insane.
Yeah. It's like points against, points for, who you played for, who you didn't play. It was like, oh my goodness.
That 1921 WJ team had to take like a 3-day train ride. There were no planes then out to California, and they played the University of California to a 0-0 tie, and they had scored a touchdown, and it got called back. So there's, felt there was some homerism going on, but they were able to be designated that. So that was a great story. So it's been a lot of fun with a lot of different angles. my Joe Frazier story is a little bittersweet because of how things ended up with him. David, I sent you a picture of, his rundown gym where he lived in the last
Oh,
days of his
that
life.
was
And
great. That
yeah,
might even be on the cover. I love that
yeah,
picture.
yeah, it was sad. But the
Yeah.
story there was it was a Philadelphia policeman who um, who borrowed money from his union and bought two shares in a company called Cloverlay, which became the business management company for Joe Frazier, and that begat a company that is the largest um, uh, company that does closed circuit broadcasts around the country. They do 2,500 events a year. So that was just a different angle to it. Mark Cram wrote a great biography on Joe Frazier, but I didn't want to, go back and just like tell the Joe Frazier story and throw in Manila or all that other stuff. We had hoped that people would look at the nuances that we're doing. Everything has a different angle. I wrote a story on the '74 Steeler draft through my brother's eyes. I lost my brother earlier this year. He was a scout for the Steelers on that team, so he had some stories that he was able to give me about that team. I'll tell you a quick one. Was Lambert part of that team or not, David?
He was
Oh, yeah,
part of
yeah,
that draft. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
So
Second round
my
pick.
my brother was sent to Kent State to look at a different player, and while he was there, it had rained, and they wouldn't let the players on the field because the field was muddy because they practiced on the same field they played. So they said, "No, you're going to have to practice in the parking lot." So there was a skinny white guy, Jack Lambert, who was picking stones out of his legs, because he was going full bore in a parking lot, and he was just absolutely fearless. So my brother came back and he said, "Yeah, this other guy's pretty good." His boss was Art Rooney Jr., who is, who's up again for the Hall of Fame designation. He said, "I think Art, you need to go look at this guy, Jack Lambert." So that was kind of a neat inside story about that particular draft.
Yeah, I love the again the different angles and kind of
Right.
the forgotten stories and the what ifs, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
You guys talked about when we were talking about basketball. You talked about Duquesne, having a really rich history that I think doesn't get talked about enough. And one of my favorite forgotten stories we've delved into on this show was when the University of Tennessee came and refused to play because Duquesne had a black player, Chuck Cooper,
Yes.
and Duquesne basically stood up to them and said, no, he's going to play. You guys devote an entire chapter in this book to Duquesne's place in integrating college basketball. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That was one of the great. We've dealt with that so many times. I did a Chuck history biography with his son, um, Chuck the Third, and that was a big part of that. December 23rd, I believe, 1946, um, where
That was in McKeesport, wasn't it? They were playing in
that
McKeesport.
Mm-hmm.
that was a big key sport. Yeah, after the war, they sold that where Duquesne played on campus at the time, ended up selling their seats in the war effort. So they kind of went around the city, and then they played at the Duquesne Gardens. But that day they were playing in McKeesport, and they were playing Tennessee. Tennessee would make agreements when they'd come up north with the coaches. We don't want to have our players play against black players, so you have to promise to sit them and not play them. Um, and his name was John Morrow, the coach, and he thought he had an agreement with Chick Davies. Chick basically told him first he'd say, "Well, we won't play him unless we need him," and that wasn't good enough for John Morrow. And then Judge Samuel Weiss, who was the head of the Duquesne athletic administration, which ran the sports at the time, basically said, "No, we if you will not play against Chuck Cooper, then we're going to send you home without any money, and we're going to forfeit this." And he told the fans to go home, and he had enough. And it was a great moment, not only in our history, but I mean, showing how Duquesne had been supportive of integration at a time when it was not common to be supported. We had some of the greats, Composi, the great owner of the Homestead Grays, who was the only man um, to be in the both basketball and baseball Hall of Fames. He was a great innovator, and he developed the jump shot basically in the early 19 teens as he brought 5 colored championships to the Pittsburgh area. But he played for Duquesne. He was our leading scorer for a couple of years. Chuck Cooper, certainly the first African American. Tom has done a huge amount of works with their foundation. Chuck Cooper, who was a great hero of mine, was the first African American to be drafted into the NBA. He was also the first Boston Celtic to hold out because he wanted, it wasn't enough for him to be there. He put his career on the line because he wanted to be paid the same as the white players on the team, and he won. He was also the first African American to step on court in an NBA game. While it's not considered official because it was a preseason game, he still was there, and he was there while people were certainly showing their prejudice in the stands against him. It was a very pressurized situation for him. We had Jim Tucker, who in NBA lore was one of the first 2 NBA players to win an NBA championship, but he had the quickest triple-double in NBA history until Jokic broke it a couple years ago. We had Dick Ricketts and Cy Green. Cy Green, the 2-time consensus All-American. Dick Ricketts, the Player of the Year in 1955 when we won our national championship. Still the leading scorer and rebounder in school history. Ricketts and Green were the first and the only NBA first overall picks to be drafted in consecutive years by one school. And that's something that the school still holds as a proud moment. But these things were all part of our history. We became, like the Dodgers became a dominant team in the National League because they were willing to sign the best players regardless of color. Duquesne became the Alabama of college basketball in the 1940s and 50s because they didn't care who they were signing. They were aggressive in signing African American players. Fletcher Johnson, who became one of the great surgeons, ironically, in our country's history, was a preeminent 6-man for the team during their run in the early 50s. So we certainly honor those players. In that chapter, and as alumni, and I know Tom can especially speak to what Chuck Cooper has meant to our university. It's just a pride point, and it was an honor to have it included in the book.
It's the 75th anniversary of what they're calling the Pioneers, the year that the NBA was integrated, and it's also the centennial year of Chuck's birth. So we've got a big gala that we're planning on April 15th, for that. But as I mentioned, I think, the Steel Bowl was probably, and also the Ron Bowl Classic were kind of the preeminent basketball events, in the Pittsburgh area at a time that the Condors and the Pipers were trying to chisel their way into the landscape. I think that's one of the things that kind of hurt, the chances of having a team, because Duquesne would draw 6 or 7 or 10 or Sunday afternoons. Duquesne play Villanova. There'd be 10,000 people at the arena. Those were great matchups.
Yeah, I'm a Duquesne alum as well, and so definitely appreciate you guys, giving just due to the history there, because there's
I feel so left out not being a Duquesne.
He was a Pitt guy. We'll let that slide.
No, well, Pitt had some great they had some great basketball teams too. It was that you guys. We tried to actually resurrect the Steel Bowl several years ago with when we were doing work with Duquesne, but there just wasn't the interest. It's really hard to recruit the other 2 teams. They play the city game for a while, but getting the other 2 teams to convince very difficult. So
one of the really kind of unique and great events in sports is played in Pennsylvania that people don't always talk about, and that is the Little League World Series. And I think you guys cover that, and I believe the specific event you cover is when Monet Davis, who I believe is also from Pennsylvania, played in that. What did you guys find compelling about that story?
Well, it was a special thing. She was from Philadelphia, which made it even more special. Pennsylvania doesn't always get a lot of participants in that, but just how she not only, I mean, it's one thing for a girl to participate, another thing for them to completely dominate a series. And just that moment that she had her shutout in World Series play, and the play up to getting to Williamsport. Recently, she was drafted as a 10th overall pick in the upcoming women's professional baseball league that's going to start next year. So that kind of made is bringing the story to light a little bit on a national level as she did that. But just in the great history of that event, which I mean has become just a bear for ESPN now. Who would have thought 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that millions of people would be tuning in to watch Little League World Series? In fact, I think 5 million people tuned in, if I'm not mistaken, to the broadcast when she pitched there, which is still the record. But
they're showing regional games now, like that's wild. Like,
yeah,
like you watch, you'll be seeing California and Oregon, like two Little League teams from, oh my goodness, a Little League game on TV, national TV. That's
unbelievable.
Blows my mind. Yeah.
I lived in Texas, and very close to a town called Spring, and Spring was a champion, I think, in the late '90s of that. And all of Houston was totally. That's where I lived in the Houston area. Was totally captivated by the Little League World Series because of the local team. It was we see it in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, and we kind of understand because it's maybe only a couple hours away. But it was fun to watch it from Texas and see people so captivated by it.
Lloyd McClendon, who played for and then managed the Pirates, also has a pretty rich history, I believe, with the Little League World Series. He was a big Little League World Series hero when he was played in it as a kid, and through the magic of YouTube, we even found a clip of him as a kid talking to Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle was there, and they have a footage of that. So it's got an amazing history, that event.
Absolutely.
You guys talked earlier about the Philadelphia Athletics 1929 to 31, that great team that they have. And I'm not sure if you guys cover this or not in the book, but my understanding is that team was largely responsible for pushing the state legislature to abolish the blue laws that they had that prevented Sunday sporting events. And that's really the impetus, I believe, for the founding of both the Steelers and the Eagles. Is that right?
It was. Yeah. It was. They were part of it. I mean, obviously, Tom's uncle Art was a huge part of it. In fact, until that first season in '33 for the Steelers, until the law was officially passed, they would play games during the week,
Wednesday nights.
The first part of that, the first part of that season. But I mean, Connie Mack was. I mean, he was started actually managing the Pirates in the 19th century, but he was just a legendary figure in Pennsylvania history, and that was one of his contributions was starting to push for that.
Wore a suit and tie in the dugout.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm sure it helped to have this wildly popular, successful team being the ones pushing for it, right? I'm sure that if you're a politician, I'm sure that the people are going to want to do what the team wants at that point.
It just opened up a lot of possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you mentioned the Steelers having to play on Wednesday nights. They couldn't play on Sundays, but he also didn't want to go against high school football or college football. I mean, it was, those early years when the Steelers were actually called the Pirates for the first 5 years. It was almost like semi-pro. The players had other jobs. There's no way that you could subsist on a pro football career. It was really looked down upon by a lot of the sports writers at the time, because college football was just such the king. So
yeah. Your uncle, what was it, the pre-Steeler team that played on the north side?
The Hope Harveys.
Yes,
Well, there were two:
yes,
the Hope Harveys and the Rooney Reds. Yeah,
yes, yeah.
and the JT Rooneys. Yeah, there's we just did a private event for a client a couple weeks ago at the Hall of Honor. And if you guys have not been there, it's phenomenal. And I had Kevin Colbert with me, and we did our own curated tour for about 40 people for this healthcare company. And it was amazing. So we went over to the bus, and we said, okay, ask a question about a player. So, the 40 buses are up there, and somebody would say, Troy Polamalu. And then, Kevin would go through, everything that happened with how they drafted him, what I thought of him. And then I sort of was the guy from the older players, because I knew the stories growing up about Ernie Stotner and, people like that. So, but it's an amazing experience over there if you guys haven't been over there. So.
Very cool.
Yeah.
You have the 50 stories in the book. Or were there any stories that you wanted to tell but didn't make the final cut?
There are so many. I mean, the hope is in the next few years that the book does well enough, we can do a second and third edition. I mean, as a boxing fan from the 70s, I wanted to tell about Larry Holmes. It just was one of the last ones I knocked out. There are so many things with football in the 19th century here, with Latrobe actually having the bid to build the Hall of Fame there, and how that fell apart. The Pro Football Hall of Fame should have been in Latrobe, and how that fell apart. And what we ended up deciding on was something that's as a Greensburg. That's my hometown. I wrote a story at the beginning on the 1897 Greensburg Latrobe matchup, which to me, judging from everything people have found, although can never really, being that the contracts are never going to be brought up to prove that every player on that field was paid, but basically from a lot of research that people have done, to me, that is the first professional game where everybody was paid in football history, and so I wanted to tell that. I thought that was probably something we hadn't touched on in our last books, and that was it. But those things, Ed Apataccio, who was a Pirate and during their first decade, was also one of the great football players of that era. That was a last minute cut. The great first two-way football baseball player. There was a chapter I wanted to do on the Pirates hockey team, on the Yellow Jacket hockey team, which was
like I can never. Boy, I tried. I remember I was doing like teams that aren't here, like kind of like you were doing, and I could not find much of anything about like those teams. They played in the Duquesne Gardens, didn't they?
Yeah.
I beyond that, I couldn't tell you much about them. Like,
well, they were the first team that actually used lines, and
wow,
that came up in one of the books we were researching. A colleague of ours, Robert Healy, was going through something. He said, "Hey, did you know that they actually were the first team to use lines?" And I hadn't at the time, and I thought that was back then. I guess hockey players played 60 minutes.
Wow.
And
sounds exhausting.
Exactly.
David, you mentioned the boxing, the lore in boxing. A friend of ours did write a book on Pittsburgh boxing history, but there's so many great nuances. You talk about Larry Holmes. I had a chance to work with Don King on the Imminent Danger, the fight at the Civic Arena in 1981, and that was one I could have had a field day with David, just writing from the
Absolutely.
background, hanging around with Don King. So that's one I regret not doing.
Yeah, I
Don King.
imagine that could be a whole
Wow.
book in and of itself. It's just
I
Don
mean,
King.
maybe I'll get you in trouble here, Tom, but you kind of have firsthand knowledge of Don King. In your opinion, do you think Don King is the reason like boxing's in the shape like that the UFC is basically taken over what boxing was? I mean, do you think he played a hand in that?
Yeah, maybe. I got to know Aram and King. And I think there's some sociological issues with with the boxing too. That the demographics have sort of changed. But it was a wonderful area. I think at one time, David, didn't we have like 6 of the 18 champions at one time or something crazy?
In the 30s and 40s, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we had Charlie Burley, who was considered one of the great middleweights of all time, who, because of his color, never had a chance to fight for the title.
Yep.
Yeah, going back to hockey, one of the other stories you guys write about in this book is when the Flyers had the kind of the all-out war with the Soviet Red Army team, which of course was partially taken over a couple decades later by the Penguins.
Yeah.
That got pretty ugly, didn't it?
Oh, it was very ugly. I mean, at the time, the Cold War was really in its height, and the Cold War had come to the ice. The one interesting thing I had found about it was a very brutal game. In fact, the Red Army walked off the ice at one point after a couple Flyer cheap shots. I mean, the Broad Street Bullies were at their core at that point, and basically they were told they weren't getting paid, and that's why they came back on the ice. But it was a savage game. The Flyers dominated. It was a time where the Soviets were dominating just about every NHL team they played, including the Penguins, in this exhibition series. And the thing I found most interesting when I was looking back was the newspapers in Philadelphia were treating it as a normal newspaper would treat a Super Bowl win. I mean, it was almost the entire content of the paper that day. What was this, from the front page through the sports? It would be very difficult to find another story that happened that day. It was that big in Philadelphia.
Now I just for timing. Now I know Karlamov. I've seen interview. He said he didn't want to come back for the third period of that game, but he did. Was that before? Because Bobby Clark was on that Flyers team, right?
Oh yeah.
So was this before or after the Summit Series? Because
it was after. 72 was the Summit Series.
So this is after. Well, why is he playing Bobby Clark again? That guy broke his ankle in 72.
Yeah. Then it was a Canadian versus Russia series in 72. That was the first time they had ever.
But that's a big reason the Canadians won, is because Bobby Clark slashed Karlamov and broke his ankle. Yeah,
because they were down those last couple games, and they were going back.
It was like a weird 9-game something or other. Yeah,
9 games. Yeah. I actually had just ordered it because I'd only seen bits and pieces of the game, so I found on Amazon.
Oh wow.
The whole every single game.
Well, no wonder Karlamov didn't want to come back. He didn't want to get his ankle broken again.
God, it was just. I mean, reading about this game, I mean, they were just mauled in the first period by the Flyers in this. I believe it was 76, and I don't blame them for not wanting to come on the ice. I mean, it was just the refs that turned their head the whole first period.
What really hurt those Russian teams too was the size of the ice. I mean, there was nowhere to hide, because they were used to playing on the international ice. That's a different game if you've watched it. I've been able to see a couple games live that way. I mean, it's a different game. But when you're in the cauldron of just 200 feet, well, the difference is the width. There was just no place to hide for those.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. The Boston Gardens and the Spectrum were two of the smaller rinks.
Oh yeah, Boston Gardens was, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
between the blue lines, I remember that there was. I don't know why that was, but yeah, the Gardens. I remember that more than the Spectrum.
Yeah.
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 So is there anything in the book, any little tidbits you guys came across as you were doing the research that you were like, oh wow, I never knew that before?
I have one. I was in the stands. I worked for the Penguins, and one of the times was when Mario scored those 5 goals on New Year's Eve, and I was in the stands, and I knew what was going on because I was keen. I remember leaving the arena. We had dinner reservations. It was a 3 o'clock game. We had dinner reservations across the street at I forget the name of the restaurant. It was called Hugo's or something across the street. But I was like shaking. But what I found out when I talked to Paul Steigerwald, because I interviewed him because he called that game, was that the broadcasters didn't know. Tom McMillan's story the next day didn't even mention the 5 ways goals. And one of the interesting things, because when I was at the game and I saw the 5th goal go in, the actual light, the green light went on, marking the end of the game um, before it was called a goal. And so, no one's ever talked to the referee about whether he also knew and he wanted that a moment to happen. But I think what happened was maybe there was a split-second difference between the puck going in the goal and the guy trying to flash the light. But I was surprised that hardly anybody knew, the media or the broadcast team, that what had just happened. That someone had scored 5 goals the only way you could do it, in regulation. So that was a little surprise for me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess that makes sense because it never happened before, so it wasn't like there was a bar.
Yeah, and it was 8-6 game too. So I mean, it was like there's so much going on,
Yeah.
But I thought it was ironic that game the Devils and the guy who was the very second pick in that draft, Kirk Muller, he scored a goal in that game, and of course we came very very close to Mario Lemieux being a New Jersey Devil. Had our friend Eddie Johnson not tanked, at the end of the season to get that pick. So there's a lot of, I think I read about that too. There was a lot of sort of inside intrigue into that game.
Although I believe Eddie Johnson's still on record as never admitting to tanking. Is that correct?
He's a close friend of mine. I think he's come around. His pat answer now is, "Hey, Eddie, did you tank the season to get Mario?" And his answer is, "What would you do?"
Good answer. Good answer.
What would you do?
Good deflection.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that. I know pretty much everybody else, coach and everybody else has admitted, we lost on purpose, but EJ's always been kind of.
Well, there's a guy named so Roberto Romano. We used to do handle our Baltimore teams and our Wheeling teams, from the standpoint of marketing and things like that. And so I actually went to quite a few skipjacks games. And Roberto Romano was a promising goalie, and we sent him down because he was playing too well. And EJ traded for a guy named Vincent Tremblay, who might have stopped Pittsburgh Spirit soccer balls, but he wasn't stopping hockey pucks, and that was the move. So.
Well, in the 1990s, the Pirates had played the Blue Jays in an exhibition game at the Sky Dome, and we were going up to it, and we were stopping in Niagara Falls overnight, and we went in this bar, and I had my Penguins hat on, and this bouncer comes up and says, "Could you come with me to the office?" So I didn't know what the heck he was doing, so I bring him to the office. They sit, our friends and my wife, at a table, and I go in this office, and this guy's sitting there, and he puts his hand out. He goes, "My name's Roberto Romano."
Oh my God!
He was the owner of the bar,
and
he saw I was walking in with a Penguin hat. I guess they had their cameras on, and I spent a half hour, and my wife and friends were scared to death, wondering why the hell I hadn't come back to the table. And we had this nice conversation with a half hour, and he was laughing at that particular thing of when he was sent down. for that. I mean, he knew damn well why he was sent down, and he got the biggest kick out of it.
Yeah, and Vincent Tremblay, I believe Bob Erie or someone said he was a milkman. He was delivering milk before that, or something to that effect. And only played in like 4 or 5 games, but was so terrible that that's all they really needed was to just get a leg up on the Devils. We did an episode about that season, and it's amazing when you dig into the details of it because that Devils team was something like the 13th or 14th worst team in NHL history. And so the Penguins literally had to be, in the top 12 to surpass them. And if you look at the trajectory of that season, all the way up until January, if you read like the Post Gazette or Press, it's like, well, the Penguins might still be in playoff position if they can win these next 2 games at home. They weren't terrible, and then it wasn't until about January or so that they really started going in the tank. So they really had to work hard to get Mario, and thank goodness they did.
I heard about Mario. I heard about Mario the year before. He was playing his last year in juniors because EJ had said to me, "There's a guy, Val, who is going to be, better than anybody." So he had it in his back of his mind. Now, had they had a season where maybe by January he realized they weren't going to be any good, but I remember Mr. DeBartolo, who didn't go to many hockey games. He actually flew his jet up to watch him play up in Canada, and another kind of unsold story. The Pittsburgh Spirit were outdrawing the Penguins at one time, and we operated them too. And I was in a meeting in Youngstown where where they were talking about whether to keep the Spirit or keep the Penguins. And the Spirit, their problem was they had a great regular season, but they kept getting knocked out like in the first round of the playoffs. And that sort of, well, you can imagine what would happen, if we would have not had the Penguins. We almost lost the Penguins a number of times. I mean, they've been resurrected, many, many times.
Yeah. The Spirit, David, you talked about the Maulers being your first season ticket. That was me for the Spirit. And in those games, I still have really fond memories of that. And I remember you talked about the playoffs. I remember the year that they lost to Cleveland in the first round. There was like an overtime game. It was a tough loss because they had a really good team that year. So yeah, that's another interesting, what could have been. And you guys talked about defunct teams. There's so many great defunct teams that I think people have a lot of fond memories of, and will be happy to read about in this book for sure.
That could be another book, David. I think you and I have talked about that.
We have several times.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think every little, like Washington, PA. I lived down that area for a while. They had a St. Louis Cardinals D team. Teams would have like 13 affiliates.
Oh yeah, there was a Pennsylvania league, which Washington was part of. Butler, my hometown of Greensburg had a team with the Cardinals. My dad used to go to the stadium to watch the Gas House Gang in the 30s there. So yeah, that was a very very interesting. Jeanette had a team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Spirit. There still is a major indoor soccer league. I'm actually on a board with a guy in Los Angeles who owns a team in the Los Angeles area in Ontario, California. And the commissioner of the league, if you're a Spirit fan, you'll be interested to know that the commissioner of the league is a fellow named Keith Tozer. He was one of our Spirit players. So I actually talked to him about 6 months ago. So they're trying to bring that back. The economics of owning a sports team, we used to always say that, a Penguin hockey game or a Bruno Sammartino wrestling event, 15,000 people, beer, hot dogs, nachos, whatever it would be. We operated the concession, so we made a lot of money, right? Well, the Spirit was 1 Coke and 2 straws, because it was all kids. It didn't drive the revenue that that we would want. And then those Mr. DeBarlo was a funny sort of a guy, with the Maulers. We all said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And he did it. And he said, by the way, I'm doing it and you're doing it. So, that was a year from hell. I felt like I was in purgatory my Uncle Art, the only time I ever heard him mad in person, he said, Tommy, he said, I got DeBarlo into the league and he stabbed me in the back. Because, the Barlows had been kept out of Major League Baseball by Bowie Kuhn because they were trying to buy the White Sox. But because of the alleged, mob ties, it wasn't. And my uncle had a lot of business with the DeBarlos because they owned racetracks. My uncle sold racetrack. They did a lot of business together. So he really stood up for him. But he was really, really mad about the Maulers.
Oh, wow. And when you say he got the DeBartolos into the league, what do you mean by that?
Oh, he stood up for them. In other words, when they
bought San Francisco, how long have they owned?
Oh, yeah, when they bought the 49ers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Well, which they still kind of own to this. I mean,
yeah.
Nephew,
so Eddie got in trouble when they, he tried to he put $400,000 in a paper bag and gave it to the governor of Louisiana for a dog license there. And
wow, I've never heard that before.
Oh no. I mean, that's you can go. That's he became a state witness against the governor, and he got immunity. Well, I mean, so that got him kicked. That got him kicked out of running the 49ers. So
that's why he had to give it to his sister,
Marie Denise DeBarlo. Yeah, and her son was Jed, who runs the team. I remember Jed coming in in a station wagon, the hockey games, a little kid running around. But yeah, that's how they go. And Mr. DeBarlo, we used to have to go to Youngstown for meetings all the time, and Mr. DeBarlo used to take lunch. But somebody asked him one day about the mob in Youngstown. He said, "If you live in Youngstown, it's impossible not to know someone from the mob." So anyway.
So we'll wrap this up with one last question. Now that this book's done, what are you guys working on next?
We'll come up with something. I mean, I have something with Rob Inkakowski coming up on unique baseball stories that'll be out for opening day. Angles like, we talked to the guy who was the third baseman the day Cal Ripken broke the all-time record, things like that. Next year, I have a book coming out on the 1955 Pitt Panthers, the Sugar Bowl team with Bobby Greer, where they broke segregation in the South with Greer playing in the Sugar Bowl.
I can tell you that I've been talking to David. So Kevin Colbert, Barry Totten, who was the coach at Central, they want to celebrate the Catholic League. So they're talking about a Catholic League Hall of Fame, the history of the Catholic League. And so I think I talked to David. I thought a book about the history of the Catholic League would be really good. All the great players that come out of there.
Is there's still one in Philadelphia, isn't there? Or is that just like a private school league?
Boy, I think it's a private school league.
Yeah, it's just a private.
I know that was big in basketball over the years.
Because I think it's like that IMG Academy, like those kind of like that kind of.
Which is actually something we cover in the book. Wilt Chamberlain's Philadelphia high school against Farrell, who were the PIAA champions, but they couldn't play because Chamberlain played at a Catholic League school that wasn't part of the PIAA. So that big upset in the 50s is covered in the book, and we break down why those schools could never play.
Mm-hmm. A trivia for you on the Catholic League. So my cousin Dan Rooney, the late Dan Rooney, who was he was a quarterback for North Catholic, and he finished all Catholic League second team quarterback to Johnny Unitas. Johnny Unitas was at St. Justin, and he was.
Yeah, he might have some trouble beating him out. I'm thinking.
Well, the funny thing, Dan used to always tell the story that the Steelers cut Johnny Unitas, and Dan they cut him in revenge. There's Joe Montana. I mean Tommy Clements. The players that came through the Catholic sports leagues were
but that certainly would be an interesting subject, and certainly will be on the docket going forward.
Yep. Yeah, that would be great. The 55 Sugar Bowl, I think that'd be another great story, because the governor of Georgia wanted Georgia Tech to forfeit that game.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really great history there too, and then there's some controversy in that game. So
if you watch the clip of that play, which I have several times, you read the recount in the papers at the time. They claim it was a foul, but you look at the play, there is no way that's a pass interference call.
Yeah. And then it makes you wonder, because we have plenty of bad missed pass interference calls today, right? Was it intentional, or was it just one of those things that could happen on any play? And
the referee was actually from Pittsburgh.
From Pittsburgh, that's right. Yeah. So
my old boss Paul Martha used to talk about, he was on that 63 team that was supposed to play Navy, the
No Bowl.
Yeah.
Which we have a book we just put out on that called Uninvited. Very fascinating.
Was Ditka on the No Bowl team?
No,
he wasn't. Okay.
That was after him. Yeah.
No, Ditka. I one of the greatest hits in life was the assassination weekend at Forbes Field. It was a big controversy. Pete Rozelle always regretted, not canceling or postponing those games. But the Steelers played the Bears that weekend, and I think Ditka was a rookie that year. And sometimes you see it pop up on NFL films or whatever. He made a catch and run where he looked like, Darnell Washington, like on steroids.
just running people over.
Yeah, and just dragging people to the end zone. And he said that he was a combination of the adrenaline of playing back in Pittsburgh for the first time as a pro, and the circumstances around the assassination. He was on just such an adrenaline. Anyway, a lot of great stories.
And I think, as Steve and I have done this podcast for a few years, one of the things that always amazes me is we like never run out of topics.
No,
you would think that Pittsburgh sports history only has so many things to cover, but there's just layer after layer after layer, and story after story, and things that people didn't know about, and angles you can come at. So, really excited to check out this book. Once again, folks, it's called Pennsylvania Made: The History of Sports in Pennsylvania. We will have links in the show description where you can find that online, but you'll also be able to find that if you live in the Pittsburgh area in your local bookstore. David, Tom, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. It was a fun morning. Thank you.
Thank you, folks, so much for listening. Remember that you can subscribe to the podcast. Please give us a rating if your podcast service allows that. You can also check us out online on Facebook or Instagram, and we will catch you next time.